Welcome back to the Cool Zone, where we document life in one of those phases of history where it seems decades happen in weeks. I remain your host, Thomas, and today I want to explore the issue of liberalism and why social democracy cannot succeed. Furthermore, why it is improper for socialists to vote alongside presupposed party lines. First, let us understand what liberalism is. To really understand liberalism, we have to first read some of the earliest texts combating it. Most notably, Combat Liberalism by Mao Zedong. Here, Mao says, we stand for active ideological struggle because it is the weapon for ensuring unity within the party and the revolutionary organizations in the interest of our fight. So he's saying, we have to be active in our praxis. We cannot merely sit at home. We cannot merely do nothing, right? And he says liberalism rejects this ideological struggle and stands for unprincipled peace, thus giving rise to a decadent and Philistine attitude and bringing about political degeneration in certain units and individuals in the party and the revolutionary organizations. So, what he's referring to here is the idea that under liberalism, we see this idea that ideology under liberalism is much the same as identity in a bourgeois context. There is no reason to have any ideology under liberalism except that it is appealing to you, except that the people around you share it, except that it is a cultural tie. You see, in order for ideology to mean anything, it has to come out of the material conditions of your existence. And under liberalism, one must ignore these material conditions, which would give rise to struggle, which would give rise to misunderstanding, which would give rise to experience, right? And under liberalism, especially in a liberal democracy, one must reject this material truth and instead pick things largely just because that's the team that you pick. In modern America, we see this exemplified really by the two-party state that we live under. At the end of the day, both parties essentially do the same things. The Republicans go further right and become crypto-fascists, and the Democrats just aren't the Republicans. That's all they have to do is not be Republicans. And they do that terribly, right? And over time, naturally, this will shift the United States further and further right and has shifted the United States further and further right because the Democrats, who were ostensibly the party of the working man, ostensibly the Labor Party, ostensibly the more left party, were centrists at the beginning against a rather far right, rather radical party, and have simply shifted further and further right all the time, all along, because they were never creating an ideology for themselves. They were never struggling. They were never doing anything except gathering people in under the auspices of being something other than the Republicans, which now they're having a hard time keeping up with because now, of course, it is them who is opposing more welfare. It is the Liberal Party who is opposing aiding the poor or a better workstation or a Green New Deal, as it were. And this comes down to the fact that they have adopted this decadent, this Philistine attitude. They have degenerated from their original party positions to allow things to slide, to become a so-called big tent party. And this follows in with Mao's further types of liberalism. There are 11 principal types. And my goal here is to discuss how we see some of these in our modern day-to-day lives, but also how best we can combat them and why these things taken together ultimately mark out the issue with social democracy, the issue with incrementalism, the issue with compromise for true Marxists. Let us begin. To see someone harming the interests of the masses and yet not feel indignant or dissuade or stop him or reason with him, but to allow him to continue, is Mao's eighth type of liberalism. You see, in the ideological struggle, the first and foremost thing that we must always consider is the condition of the proletarian. There is no purpose in a vanguard party that does not and cannot help its people whom it serves. And ultimately, it only exists to serve the proletariat. When we see a party, such as the Republican Party, malign and abuse the proletariat, in a more international sense, if we look at the British Conservative Party, same thing. If we look at Christian Social Democratic Party, which is Angela Merkel's party in Germany, same thing. They do not act for labor rights. They do not seek them in any large or meaningful way. They do not improve the conditions of the worker. They only seek to export much of the worker's pain elsewhere, if that. And you see, the issue comes from the fact that the right wing largely are grifters. It is very rare in a modern neoliberal context that your right wing, that your crypto fascists believe what they're saying. The leadership certainly does not. You see, the nature of capital is that it will over time accrue upwards. As a society progresses, as society advances, capital and money must be consolidated to a smaller and smaller portion of the bourgeois. This is due to, many things, class interests most notably, and the idea that the bourgeois will always control a liberal bourgeois democracy. They do this because as the liberals constantly compromise with them over the left, which they do because the liberals, of course, are interested in maintaining peace, and the liberals, of course, see that that peace can be best maintained through the current system, which they live under. So you see, if we allow moderation, if we allow the moderates to exist, they will always have to shift right, because they will have to preserve the peace, and that is how they can do that. And so, as over time those moderates slip right, they are failing in this eighth type of liberalism to combat the right wing. And so to combat that, what a Marxist has to do is they have to organize the proletariat. They have to stand in solidarity. They have to help create labor strikes and labor unions. They have to help advance the life and the quality of life of the proletariat in whatever region they're in. This could be a lot of things. According to Che Guevara, who I would consider probably the most modern, widely read and accepted Marxist theorist that has, significant pull, he would say, go out to a city, go pick the poorest part of that city and speak to the people and find their problems and commit the party to fixing their problems one at a time. And when that area's problems are fixed, you go to the next poorest and the next poorest and the next poorest. And in doing so, you will build a cadre that is far more powerful and far more loyal to the Marxist cause than anything else. And in the USSR, we see a similar thing. In their 1917 revolution, we see Comrade Lenin leading many strikes. But ultimately, right, the vanguard party there just happened to catch the tail end of one horde of strikes in 1917. They didn't really start them. They just noticed that they were happening, and according to many correspondences, really initially didn't even think that it was happening right then. And this is okay. This is acceptable. To hear incorrect views without rebutting them, and even to hear counter-revolutionary remarks without reporting them, but instead to take them calmly as if nothing had happened. This is the sixth type of liberalism, according to Mao. This part is similar to a statement made by Martin Luther King Jr. As regards moderates. Quote, Oh, and this is from a letter to the Birmingham jail. Quote, I must make two honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the past few years I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace with the absence of tension to a positive peace which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he could set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythological concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. And so we're seeing a theme here, which is that it would be better to hear full on counter revolutionary remark and speak out against it, and to immediately rebut it and to immediately attack it as such, right? It is better that you go find a fascist and talk to him and understand what he is saying and give him the critical response necessary to dissuade him from that thought than for you to hear the liberal speech, to hear the liberal prattle of, one day at a time, someday the courts will be ours, someday we will elect the president, someday, someday, someday. To fail in hearing incorrect thought and to correct and correcting it, to fail to hear it, to fail to correct it, is liberalism. It is a massive failure on your part. It is a massive failure on the Marxist part because you are allowing something almost worse than outright fascism, which is liberalism, to exist. Because liberalism will sap away power from both sides and yet ultimately become fascist. Never in history has liberalism gone further to the left except following violent revolution. Never. There has been no occasion wherein incrementalism has helped the proletarian cause, except by which it was a bourgeois, a petty bourgeois, a liberal revolution coming decades before a more violent proletarian revolution. If you allow your friends, your family, your coworkers to be liberals and to not combat that wrong thought, then you are allowing fascism to take over their lives, which is unfair, yes, but also your life, which should be considered wrong. You do not want to be a fascist. You do not want to support a fascist. To let things slide for the sake of peace and friendship when a person has clearly gone wrong, and refrain from principled argument because he is an old acquaintance, a fellow townsman, a schoolmate, a close friend, a loved one, an old colleague, or old subordinate. Or to touch on the matter lightly instead of going into it thoroughly so as to keep on good terms. The result is that both the organization and the individual are harmed. This is the first type of liberalism. So you see again, Mao has brought up this inaction. A lack of action, a lack of praxis is equivalent to liberalism. Because ultimately, your duty is to enact the social world. Your duty is to enact theory through praxis, praxis, into the world. And if you are not doing that, if you are failing to do that, then you are not being a good comrade. You're not being a good revolutionary. You are not aiding the cause of the people. And if you are failing to aid the cause of the people, what are you ultimately doing? But harming them. Harming them. And how dare you harm the proletarian who is already set so far back by his material conditions? And so this is where we begin to find the dangers and the issues of the socialists, especially the Marxists, working within the pre-existing system. In a liberal democracy, all your rights are defined by a negative ways, right? You understand what you can and cannot do because they tell you the things that you cannot do, and they tell you what they will do to you if you do them. As such, the system is designed in a hegemonic way to suppress you from doing anything which would be against the system itself. The system has already banned any thought beyond itself and has in fact created a social and political status in which it can act as it pleases. And what I mean to say here is never assume that the system, especially a liberal democracy, has to follow its own rules. It follows whatever it pleases. There is a difference between morality and law, and in the same way there's a difference between action and law. You see, technically speaking, America has many rights that you just never get, right? Technically speaking, as a black man in America, I have the right to be tried before a court of law. However, in action, this may never happen. I may plea out of this. I may waive this right without really knowing it. After having been arrested and charged for a crime, I may plea to my attorney or to the prosecutor and say, hey, how about I just go to prison for a year? Even though all I did was steal a bag of chips, and I don't have to get that expensive lawyer involved, and you don't have to waste the state's time. Most cases here are solved that way. And you see, this is an example of the system theoretically gives me the right to not have to do this, but because it is so difficult to access these rights, I can't, and I must bend, right? I must bend down and dissuade these rights. I must give them up. So you see, under liberalism, you create a system wherein the hegemony, right, the ways that power moves, the ways that capital moves, the way that people are influenced, the propaganda systems, the entertainment systems, Pan Am et circuses, bread and circuses, come together to dissuade the proletarian from ever changing anything, to dissuade the proletarian from complaining, to dissuade the proletarian from doing much of anything. And they do this because they will only ever encourage what is profitable to them. They will only ever allow what is profitable to them. They will only ever perform what is good for them and their shareholders. And that's natural. That's what we expect from a liberal. That's what we expect from a capitalist. The issue, however, is that the social democrat who says that capitalism can be reformed to be a better thing, who says that you can work within the system to fix it over time, who says that the system maybe is not broken, maybe is not bad, but is simply broken, merely erring currently, and can be reformed. Nothing has ever been further from the truth. Because the issue is not the system itself, but the men that created the system and the material conditions which the system has chosen to create. Over time, a social democracy may have many petty bourgeois advances for the from the liberals for the lower classes. But these, just as all liberal institutions and all liberal actions, are ultimately a bourgeois or petty bourgeois revolution at best, right? In America, we see the women's suffrage movement in the early 20th century. This was not in any way advantageous for, say, black women. This was not in many ways advantageous for women, sexually minority women. Women still couldn't even leave the hospital without their husband coming to pick them up. Women still could not get a credit card. They could not go to a bank and open an account. Women still often could not manage their own finances or accounting or really own property without a male relative or a male spouse's name on the sheet. You see, this was an advancement for a certain class of woman who was very privileged and who simply had nothing better to do with her time than to imagine going to a poll and voting. And on voting, a Marxist should not be voting. A Marxist should not be participating in a liberal democracy. He should vote, if at all, for a third party, always for a Marxist party, where there is one and when one exists. He should vote for the vanguard party, especially, because it is the function of the vanguard to exist within the political sphere only insofar as it takes to be seen and to be heard. because the vanguard must use the political sphere against the liberal parties and against the liberal democracy itself as a sort of advertisement tool, as a sort of propagandizing tool, as a way to meet the people who need it and to help them. That is the function of the vanguard party before the revolution. Today in modern America, there is no such vanguard party, and certainly neither of the prominent parties can be reformed into that. Perhaps one of the very minor parties, like the Party for Social Liberation, the PSL, right? Maybe the modern, I've seen a new American Communist Party, maybe could do something years down the line, but not now, not anytime soon. And so, in choosing which of these to support, you must consider essentially just your local area and if that's important to you. Because I would argue, ultimately, there is no reason to waste your time voting at the polls. There is no reason to waste your time doing anything that does not directly help the proletarian and clearly extenuating the liberal democracy, which is the best possible case under a Democrat win here in America, under a Labour win in the UK, under a left party win in Germany, in Israel, which is an awful country, in India, in Pakistan. In any of these places, right? Even though the left may coalesce around a single larger party and win something, this is not helpful because ultimately all this does is serve to further the aims of the liberal parties that have taken over and serve to continue the imperialist aims of the modern neoliberal state. So what can you do as a socialist? I've told you, you can organize, you can act in solidarity, you can donate your time and your money to helping people. But also, you should always be combating liberalism. It is easier even in modern society, often to directly combat the fascist party. But what we must do is, we must, as Marxists, help bring about the phase of splitting. We must make the liberal decide in every moment between fascism and leftism, between fascism and socialism, between fascism and Marxism. Because ultimately, just as Rosa Luxemburg once famously said, there is only socialism or barbarism. There is no alternative. There is no middle ground. And we cannot stand to live under barbarism. We cannot stand to allow the proletarian to suffer under barbarism. This is awful. And so how do we combat barbarism? How do we combat fascism? First, we must combat liberalism. And the way that we do this is we take the ideology to them and we make it a material concern. We drive home the fact always in every breath that there is a split. That the split is class-based, that ultimately all divisions in human life are class-based, that ultimately it is the duty of anyone who truly cares about people, who truly cares about working people, who truly cares about the majority of society, who truly cares about the proletarian, to destroy and combat fascism, to destroy and combat barbarism. And if the liberal will not cede to that point, then he has made himself a fascist, and you should advertise this, and you should attack him on this front. It seems this will be a much shorter episode. This is one based more out of some recent conversations I've had, some recent dialectics with comrades. I will tell you to read theory. I guess everyone says read theory. I'm still working out some kinks in getting intro and outro. As you've heard, there's the train warming up there at the beginning. Last time there was a car crash here at the end. I don't know if that will be back. I'm really glad that y'all are listening. I will be expanding to some more platforms soon. Mainly as I run out of Spotify space, I will be trying to go over to, run out of SoundCloud space. I will be attempting to go over to Spotify, YouTube, eventually Apple Podcasts, see what is to be done. Thanks for listening. See y'all on the flip side. Solidarity and respect, critical support for those of you who are more barbarian. See you later.